Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1485 of the Locked on Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday evening into Monday here in early June. Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. If you're a first-time user, get 100% as a deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That is PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. Also, want to encourage you at the top of the podcast to make us your first listen here at Locked on Hawks each and every day, and please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. Places like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, etc. And I'm joined on today's show by my friend Glen Willis of Peachtree Hoops at ATL 29. Glen and I have been doing this player capsule series for a while now. So if you missed any of those shows in the past, Joe Johnson, AJ Griffin, Sadiq Bey, etc., those will be available to you in the archive of this podcast. And today we'll be focusing on Onyeka Okongwu, a very intriguing, fun, really talented player on the Hawks roster, perhaps a bright future ahead for Onyeka. We'll get into all of what transpires there and hopefully, at least from last year and into the future in a second. First, though, I want to plug other stuff on the podcast as well. I did a 3-part NBA draft breakdown with Ben Pfeiffer last week. I've had mailbag content. Of course, Glenn and I have been talking. I had Howard Beck on the show a few weeks ago, Robbie Callan, Bill DeFilippo, et cetera, all of that on the podcast feed. So one more time, please subscribe to the podcast, tell a friend about the show. And without any further delay, we'll have the intro, and myself and Glenn will be coming back to talk about Onyeka Okongwu.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
I'm joined again by Glen Willis of ATL 129 and Peachtree Hoops to continue our player capsule series. Glenn, how are you on? I'm not going to tell people. I guess we're recording this on Memorial Day. I'll just spoil it. It's Memorial Day. How are you, sir?
Good. All things considered. I think we're doing a big move into our new house. You can see nothing on the walls, but this is the actual real background and like the
you're back.
The other background I was using was actually just my adjacent wall, so it was actually in the same room. It's just featuring a painting my daughter did a few years ago. I'm very proud of. So I got to get that up in here eventually. But it's I had no time to kind of get all dolled up. I had to throw a hat on and kind of just make it work.
No, I appreciate you doing this as always. This won't go till later in the week because but we're recording this actually just before Game 7 of Celtics Heat, so we don't know what's going to happen there. If you have questions about that, I will answer them later in the week when we know what happens and ahead of the finals. But Glenn is flexible enough and willing enough to join me for all of these episodes. We have talked, as I said before, I brought Glenn in about a lot of different players already, and today is going to be Okongwu, which is a very interesting prognosis / player capsule. He is still 22 years old until December, just finished year 3, about to be year 4. Because this is not Glenn's favorite topic, we're not going to do a lot of extension talk on this podcast, I don't think. But that's a big looming thing that's going to happen for Okongwu this summer, potentially. They're talking about extensions. He's eligible for that until October. And the big thing for me anyway, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, is that this is his first full, no injury, durable season. He played 80 games in year 3, and he had kind of a false start, had some injury stuff in year 2. He did miss 1 game with injury this year. It was a hamstring tightness, and then the other one was personal reasons. So nice to see him on the floor, still in a backup role for the most part, but started some games with Clint out, and basically everyone agrees he's already good, and the future is very bright with Okongwu. But before we dive into some specific stuff, where are you at with Okongwu at this point in time? Because a lot of people think he's a budding star or wherever he's going to be. But year 3 into year 4, where is your heart and your head stand with Okongwu?
Yeah, I'm really excited about him. I thought he showed real strides this year. It was interesting because I think sometimes Hawks fans forget. I think maybe sometimes I have to stop and intentionally remind myself the start of this past season was not great for him. Right? Yeah. It was a pretty kind of up and down, choppy start for him, but he really, really improved across the bulk of the season. It is interesting to think about the looming extension window and all that sort of stuff, because it's like you sit here and think, should his team kind of view him as someone who deserves quasi starter money? Is he there? Or would that be based upon more around all of this potential that he shows? And, what's kind of comes another dimension to that is the last, say, 3 months of this past season, where to me, he did play at a starter level, right? Yeah. But it wasn't always starter workload. He still has kind of some foul issues now and then. And so I'm extremely excited about him. I think he works really hard. I think he adds to his game consistently. But it's hard for me to say I think we should know exactly what he's going to become, because the ceiling is quite high in my view. But as is always the case, it's like, how often do players actually hit the full kind of ceiling, So I'm super excited about him. I think he's ready. I know we'll get into this, but I think he's ready to start in a vacuum. I would say, we can kind of talk about the team implications and decisions and stuff like that. But I put him like right there with Jalen and AJ in terms of like I'm just as excited about him as I am those two guys.
Yeah, and in some ways he's more proven. He has an extra year on Jalen. He has 2 years on AJ, and through no fault of his own, he's not had the opportunity to prove his entire package at this point in time. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's something you and I have said on different podcasts for months and months and years at this point. It's no one's fault that they have Clint and Onyeka on the team. Like, they have two very, very good center options. Clint is the more established veteran. He's been the starter. We'll talk about him at a later date on this player capsule series. But Okongwu, the one thing he cannot prove to this point is that he is capable of being a full-time 30-minute-a-game player. He's not been asked to do that. It's not his fault. But he was durable this year. And I was actually going to ask you if you thought that he was a starting caliber player, because we talk about that sometimes. And I know I've said it, I've kind of just thrown it out there as a casual statement, and I believe it. I think, this is not a sort of arbitrary endpoint, but I think he's a top 30, 35, 40 center in the league already, proven to be that already in the sample size that he's done, but he's not had the chance. And I want to frame it that way. It's a chance. It's not anything he's done wrong. He's not being given an opportunity because of Clint to take on that role. And that might be the case going into year 4. Nothing is assured. Like, they could still run into the season with Clint and Onyeka. I'm kind of expecting, or maybe projecting, a change of some sort potentially, but very, very possible that they go into next year with Clint and Onyeka still on the roster, and then we're talking about the same thing again, where Okongwu was going to be this 23-minute-a-game backup again. And I'm sure he wouldn't necessarily love that, but he's a great team guy. There's been no complaining. Him and Clint get along very well by all accounts. So no real issues there. But as far as like his overall performance, we'll dive into the two sides of the ball, of course. The metrics love him on a per minute basis. It is easier in some ways, especially for bigs, to be more efficient, to be more productive on a per minute basis when they're playing less minutes. That is worth noting. And the foul thing is interesting because, I pointed out sometimes that I'm a big fan of Onyeka. I like the draft pick when it happened. Like, I've been very high on him, but he's had some foul issues in the past. They actually have gotten better, which we'll get into in a second. But it's not – people, I think, listen to this podcast regularly will know this, but I'll speak for you on this one. You can correct me. You and I really like Clint. Like, we really like Clint. And it's not and I think that kind of colors things for some people, like, that might think that we're like choosing Clint. That's not really what we like Onyeka a lot too. I know I do. I think you do as well. It's just this one spot on the floor, and it happens to be the one spot on the floor where guys can't really play together, where they overlap. So I'm just throwing at the top of this podcast. I'm sure we have some new listeners along the way that might not know how we stand about this. My operating theory is that, like, it's not a bad thing to have 48 minutes of really, really, really good center play. It's just the way that the cookie has crumbled so far, and because they don't really have the capability of playing much together, they've never really tried it. It's been very, very minuscule over the last couple of years. That's just kind of left Okongwu with this 20 to 22 minute a game role. Today's show is brought to you by the award-winning app at PrizePicks. PrizePicks Daily Fantasy made easy. It's amazing. I know that you will love it as well. It's very easy to use, PrizePicks, and they also have safe and fast withdrawals. Every day during the NBA playoffs, one PrizePicks user will actually have a chance to win $1 million. Yes, one entry placed after 8 a.m. Eastern Time will be randomly selected each and every day. Whoever places that entry will give it a 6-pick flex with the following payouts: 6 correct picks, aka 6 for 6, $1 million. 5 out of 6, $80,000. 4 out of 6, $60,000. And if you want full details, you can be found at prizepicks.com/million. You must opt in at that link to be eligible for the $1 million entry. And once you opt in, all you have to do is play normally at PrizePicks, and you can be the lucky winner that is selected to have that chance to win $1 million. Download the app right now. Go to prizepicks.com, sign up, play daily fantasy sports. If you're a first-time user, get 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That is promo code Locked On for that instant deposit match up to $100. Check it out now at PrizePicks. And one more time, the URL is prizepicks.com/million.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it especially when you have it, if you project the point of attack, issues they've had on the defensive side as a team the last few years, you want 48, like, really good, back line, set the defense, anchor, you want that as much as possible. And I think the Hawks are in a really, really good spot around that. the one kind of counter thought that I have around that is depending upon what you're prioritizing, right? If you're elevating the prioritization around developing Onyeka, you probably want to give him starters workload. In my mind, he needs that to kind of throw himself into a scenario and into a context that kind of challenges him to take that next step. I don't think he has anything to prove for the most part. I mean, can he make 25 threes? And we could talk about the different phases of the game that kind of started to show up this year, right? But for me, to him to kind of really maximize his potential and to throw himself into a set of challenges that will, I believe, cause him to need to really step up and bring his best, I think he needs to be exposed to starters workload to do that. Now, there's no simple answer there. In my mind, I don't know that I'm ready to say what should the Hawks do at center. We have a little time before we kind of get into approaching the July 1 time frame, late June time frame and stuff. Well, I just know when I watch both of these guys, I think to myself, they both need to be starting. I mean, they're for one of the two to not kind of have that starters workload, they're kind of being underserved, under leveraged, utilized, or what have you. And so whatever scenario shifts that to potentially happen, or maybe not, that's just the way it looks to me, is like both of these guys are no doubt starting centers, and I have a hard time imagining myself seeing one of them as not a starter next year and thinking there's something kind of being punted or in terms of value for whichever one that would be.
Right, and we'll get into Okongwu more, but I think it's good to kind of lead with this on some level, because I agree. I think going into last year was totally fine to have these guys on the same team and have them be playing together. It is important to note Okongwu had not played more than 50 games in a season before this year. He had been banged up and he had that late start, and he is still very, very young. He was a one and done in college and all that stuff. But I do think, and it's not to say that they have to trade Clint or that they have to move on from anything like that, but I agree with you. I think for Okongwu, and if I'm his agent, if I'm his reps, I'd like him to be starting. Going into year 4 in particular, especially if he's not extended, they're going to be wanting him to play, and that's a very natural thing. It's not any animosity between the players, but Clint's still too good to be a backup. He's a top 15, 20 center in the league, so you can't just bring him off the bench. I think that's been a popular idea with Hawks fans that love Okongwu. It's just, okay, bring Clint off the bench. Well, Clint's making starter money, and Clint's a starter. That's not a move you can really make in a vacuum. So we'll talk about Clint at a later date, but it's sort of good to get into kind of how they are right now, because it's year 4 is going to be big for Onyeka. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about it at the end of this conversation again, but it's a big summer for him. It's a big year coming up for him. And that sort of sets the stage for him, because it's just all kinds of logistics and contract stuff and development. And I think we are on the same page that he needs to be playing more to sort of further his development in the future. So let's start defensively. We usually start offensively for a lot of these guys. I think Onyeka, most centers, not all, but most centers, you want to start with defense on some level. That's the end of the floor where he really, really pops in the numbers. Just for a couple of them before we dive into him, he was top 15 in the league. Yes, in the league in block rate, blocks per game, and total blocks as a backup primarily. That's very impressive to go ahead and do that. Still not perfect, but he's obviously been very good as a prospect defensively. He's improved as a rebounder. Not great there, but has gotten better in important fashion, because that was a weakness that he had to address. And then there's the foul thing, which we talked about earlier, but he's gone from 6 per 36 minutes as a rookie, then is 5.4 as a sophomore, and this year it was 4.9. That's still a lot, but it has gotten better every year. So what have you seen from him sort of taking steps forward, and where is he as a defender? Because I'm sure that some people that are listening to this podcast are like, hey, he's still 6'8". Yeah, he is.
He is. He's not the biggest guy, and that's obviously the thing that's not going to change. But I feel like there's a couple things to kind of start with on defense. Number one is that I still think he's better in space, right? His unique skills pop more when he's in space, or when he's covering ground, closing space, in those kinds of situations. The area where he's had to work harder from a technique standpoint and a discipline standpoint is a guy that wants to take him down on the low block, work on the interior, push him as a rebounder, etc. There's so much technique at play in those situations, especially as when you're often the smaller guy in that kind of scenario. A lot of his fouls, like that, still happen kind of two things. One, he still brings his hands down a lot, where he needs to be disciplined and kind of keeps his hands up.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is an instinct to know that I'm not so tall, so I don't know that I can challenge the shot at the top, which is how all centers are in the NBA are kind of taught, is to challenge the shot at the highest, point. And so maybe there's something there about him being used to kind of being the smaller guy there. The other, as a rebounder, bigger guys will come down and kind of get on top of him, and you get that kind of double hooking kind of situation, and where Onyeka is kind of hooking from underneath because he's not as big. And for whatever reason, NBA officials tend to always call the guy that kind of is hooking from the bottom. And that like, I don't, if we went back and kind of looked at all his fouls again, I'm not going to do it, but if we did, I mean, so many would come bringing his hands down in an undisciplined fashion against a guy who's driving or shooting. And then that hooking kind of situation that he's got to kind of keep himself out of that. So it's being more proactive as a rebounder, being the first guy to put the body on the other guy who's trying to rebound. And so I still think there's some stuff to clean up there, right? But it's more so when it's physical, tight quarters, down really, really close to the basket on the interior. I still think his challenges kind of show up more frequently in that context than when he's out in space. His lateral movement is like off the chart. Like, it's just wow, right? You can get him up to the level of the screen. You can use him to blitz the pick, and you can basically use him for any pick and roll coverage you want, right? Which opens up, so much opportunity to say, okay, we have a center who can drop. He's not going to be one of the best 10 drop centers in the league. He just has that kind of size, but he's gotten so much better at kind of doubling both the ball and his man, feeling that space and managing it. And so he's not below average kind of in that area, but his ability to move, his ability to get up and show with force at the point of the screen, sometimes higher there if you're blitzing or whatever, that's the stuff that just kind of really opens up doing a lot of things. And it's so interesting to think about. I still wonder, like, what does Quinn think about kind of the future? Because with Rudy, it was always drop, right, and chase over the screen on the perimeter, and he's not married to that. He's I don't want to say he's fully married to that with Clint, but that's I think any coach would lean that way with Clint for being the kind of the predominant thing you do. But with Onyeka, like, you can literally do almost anything from a scheme perspective. And part of that depends upon which other four defenders are on the floor and all that. It's lineup construction and stuff. But it's so fascinating to me to think about how he kind of opens things up. And then I know we're going to probably talk about, well, what does that mean for what the Hawks need to put next to him? Let's imagine him as a starter, right? There's a lot to think through, kind of secondary and tertiary kind of decisions that kind of flow from that. But for me, he's so confident in his ability to move and cover ground and cover space and help and make up, recover into the play from when he's out of the play and things like that. That's, to me, he's like top 10 in the league, kind of in those areas where he's kind of fighting to be consistently averages the rebounding and kind of down against really big physical centers on the interior. But I think he's made real progress there, and I hope and think he will continue to make progress. But that's where he's more of an average center out in space and all that sort of stuff. I think he's like top 10 there.
Yeah, and not to keep comparing him to Clint, but it's kind of unavoidable because of the fact that one of the challenges with having both of them, and again, good challenges, is that they're very different. So you can't just run the same stuff. And a lot of, especially the first 2 years, I think they did. They kind of asked Onyeka to do a lot of what Clint was doing, and that is tough on him. They're not the same kind of player. And I'm glad you brought that up because Okongwu's, I'm not going to say his only or primary or even, but like a main strength of his is the fact that he is so good on the perimeter. Like, that's the thought bubble around Clint, even in the draft, was like, this guy's going to be a monster on the perimeter defensively for a center. How many true centers who play most of their time there are as quick and as mobile, as versatile as he is? The list is very, very short. And part of that is that he is not very big. So that's the trade-off. He's not ever going to be a 7-footer. They're probably going to have to, if they go invest in Clint, if they invest in Onyeka long term, your backup's going to probably have to be a guy with some heft for certain matchups and certain things. But there's a lot of positive for that trade-off too, because they can do a lot of different things. And I'm glad you said it as well. Okongwu can still play drop. He still can be physical. And I think people look at his size, and I'm sure you do too. there are still people that I get in my mentions that think that he can't play center or that he's not a center. And it's like, well, I get it. He's not 6'11". He's not even 6'10". He's probably 6'8.5". And it is limiting on some level, but just to say this out loud, for every moment of his professional career, the Hawks have viewed him as a center. There's been no talk about him moving to power forward. He is a center. He's functioned as a center defensively, offensively. Yeah, maybe down the line, is there a world if they somehow had a backup who could shoot? Could he place them 4? Sure, he could. He's very versatile like that. But like his role is center, and they've always viewed him that way. And I think that it's good to kind of just embrace the versatility of that. There are limitations to certain matchups and certain things that he probably isn't going to be as good as a 7-1 guy would be at. But he's so good at other things that it gives Quinn freedom. And you brought Quinn up too. I'm looking forward to the Quinn era in a lot of different ways, but this is one where I want to see what it looks like when or if they kind of build a little bit more defensively around Onyeka, because they did that a little bit more this year. I think you can speak to that even better than I could, X's and O's wise, but let's just say thought bubble wise, let's just say they trade Clint for this exercise. The defensive structure is really going to be interesting because for the first time, they could just actually like, okay, we're going to plan on Onyeka being our guy for 32 minutes a night, 30 minutes a night. And that, I think, would change what they did, not only personnel-wise, but scheme-wise. I mean, there are limitations with Trey, but, like, you can switch more and do all those things. So I'll throw it to you as far as, like, what it might look like and what Onyeka can do. But I'm glad you brought it up because the appeal of him, for me anyway, defensively, is that he can do anything. And he's so good on the perimeter that is a true X factor that, like, especially in the playoffs, certain matchups, like, if you have a center that can guard on the perimeter like that comfortably and really well and switch and be scheme versatile, there's a lot that you can unlock with that.
Yeah, absolutely. You've seen, like with Boston in this playoffs, for example, Trey wanted to draw out Horford, right? Game 6 against Miami, Jimmy forced the switch onto Horford and got that 3-shot foul, right?
Yep.
And Horford has historically been, definitely above average and good switching. He's just getting a little older now, and it's a different kind of thing, right? And so to have a guy who can kind of do that is really valuable, especially the later in the season that you get. What I think about when I think about, okay, let's imagine Onyeka as a starter. For me, it's like I still want John Collins on this team. Is the number one thought that I have, right?
Yeah,
because if you're gonna get Onyeka away from the rim, you want a 4 who can protect the rim, who can help from the weak side, who can help rebound, and all those sorts of things. And it's not like John's some dominant rebounder, but he's a really good rebounder for a 4.
For a 4,
for a 4, right? That's, and then on top of that, if you like Onyeka gets into foul trouble, John can slide over and do 70% of what Onyeka does at center. Just from a kind of competent level, he can get out, and those sorts of things. He's not as quick and agile as Onyeka, but works hard. He knows where to be. He's proactive. And so if you need like if your backup center is going to be a big guy who can help you against Embiid or whoever the other kind of bigs are in the league and stuff like that, John gives you a guy that you can help on the back line when Onyeka is up high on the floor and all of that. Now you could always try to go find someone else who can do that besides John, right? But in my mind, it's like that the decision would be is kind of married in my head. Maybe something unexpected or something I don't see will happen. That's there. The other part is that all of the interest that some folks might have to play Hunter more at 4, Bay more at 4. To me, that gets a little harder unless you're just outright switching. You mentioned switching,
yeah.
So I think you sort of maybe kind of start to get back into a corner a little bit with how you're going to operate your smaller lineups with Onyeka if you're thinking about sliding those guys that have in the past spent more time at 3 to the 4. So I think Onyeka's ready to start. I think it's if the Hawks can make a kind of a move that brings back the right kind of stuff for Clint, I think it's worth thinking about that. But for me, I think you really have to think about, okay, what does the forward position look like to really set ourselves up for success? There's some careful things to be careful about in that area of the roster construction that I think that that seems like is missing from the conversation a lot of times for me.
Yeah, I think there is on one hand, there's sort of a paradigm where you don't want to cross it and go be too small and too reliant on switching, because I think you kind of have to if you do, especially Hunter at the 4. And always there's an element of like you're going to have a hard time being a full-on switch team with Trey, because Trey's not a switch guy. I mean, you kind of want to protect him in some ways from that. Maybe you go switch 2 through 4, and there's ways to do it. Sorry, 2 through 5. There's ways to do that. But yeah, I mean, between that and you want a little bit more heft again next to him, I think he and Jalen played well together this year, especially the second half of the season. That was encouraging. And Jalen has great size for a 4. He's not the same kind of player as Collins, but he at least has the size you're looking for next to Okongwu. And I said it once before, but you do have to have a real backup who has real size, because there's certain matchups, even if there's only 3 or 4 of them, Jokic, Embiid, et cetera, where it's not that Okongwu can't defend those guys, but you're just going to need more size for 48 minutes or 42 minutes against Jokic or Embiid or whatever, and just for versatility. Like, and Bruno, I like Bruno. I know that you like Bruno quite a bit. Probably is not going to be the guy that I want to be their number 2 center if they trade Clint. I think Bruno is a 3rd center, and a guy who can play more if he needs to is a good idea. But I would anticipate if they were to move on from Clint, they would acquire another guy who can play some real minutes, I would guess. Go ahead.
I was to say, it's not just the stars too. It's not just like
that's what I mean.
It's like like guys like Valanciunas who just are like if there's a smaller guy, we'll just work, And so there's other kind of less
he's the guy, by the way. Valanciunas is the guy who was given Onyeka particular fits. Like, he's actually
absolutely.
I remember watching those guys play. Was it in Birmingham? It was a preseason game. It didn't even matter. Yeah. But like, Clint didn't play, and Onyeka got just mauled for like 6 or 8 minutes against. It's not that he can't defend him in the future, but that sticks out to me as I was sitting courtside that night. I'm like, hey, that's not going to work. Like, he's so much bigger than him. Anyway,
and in the division, he's had trouble with Plumlee now and then. Plumlee like works really, really hard, kind of on the offensive glass, stuff like that. So now Onyeka was just much more solid the last couple months of the season in that area, but I still think there's something to show around. We can trust him with that consistently. I think there's still something to evaluate there, and to be like, I'm not sure if we're there yet or not. And so that's what's so fascinating to me. I mean, can you go into the season with kind of your top 4 guys at 4 and 5 being, or 4 of your 5 guys at 4 and 5 being Onyeka, JC, Jalen, and then a mix of Hunter and Bay, however you want to line that up. I mean, that there's a lot of switching. There's just a lot of help up at the level of the screen and using other defenders to kind of help behind that. And so that's really interesting to think about. But that, and I think about what other teams have been doing. Like, Toronto's been playing that style for a couple of seasons now, right? Who knows what they'll be next year under a different coach and things like that. But there have been teams kind of that have tried to make that work. But if you go back and look at the track record, trying to do that across the whole regular season, those teams don't typically land like top 10 in defensive rating. It's really hard to play that way the whole season and to hold up. NBA fans are like, why do teams still play drop? It's so easy to beat. Drop is low maintenance,
for
across the regular
especially.
season.
Yeah,
exactly. So I think you have to have the ability to kind of not work your big men so hard every game across the whole season, kind of choose your spots, develop the proficiency you need to maybe use that more in the postseason. And so there's a lot to think about there. Clint brings a ton in an 82-game season. And when you get into the postseason, as we see, every team needs options, especially at the 4 and the 5, depending upon what you're chasing kind of from a scenario perspective and stuff. So, but for me, Onyeka just got to keep getting better at the tactics and the kind of the dark arts of playing down inside and without getting out leveraged by bigger guys and stuff like that. He's such a hard worker. I'm confident he'll get there. I don't know that he's like there yet. Maybe 85% there, maybe from where the season, from the way it looked when the season ended or something like that, but still a little bit of ground to cover there. And that's kind of the last thing I'm kind of looking for in defense.
Yeah, he's 22, and that's part of the deal. As he plays more, he's already gotten so much better at a lot of that stuff. And I mentioned it at the very top, his rebounding has improved. And it's not always about individual rebounding, especially for bigs. Like, for instance, I know that when Clint was off the floor this year, the Hawks basically had a bottom 5 defensive rebound rate. And part of that's that Clint is, again, maybe the best rebounder in the league, certainly in the top 5. But Onyeka is not Clint. He's not going to be able to anchor that way. So you have to have other plans. Your other guys, whether it be DeJounte or your forwards or whatever, they got to help. They got to help out Onyeka more. And he's gotten better in that area. Not fouling is going to be key, all that stuff. So we covered all those bases. But there are things to consider. And just to wrap up the Clint part of this, like, you and I are definitely not trying to jettison Clint necessarily. It's just one of those things where, like we said at the top, they have to I think it's time to make a decision. Now, does it mean they have to? But when they drafted Okongwu, we knew then at some point they were going to have to probably choose. And if they didn't have to choose, it's because Okongwu didn't pan out. I think we've seen that Okongwu is panning out on some level. It doesn't mean that we know what he's going to be yet, but he's proven enough to where it's like, okay, guys, path 1, path 2. It's just the reality of the NBA for asset allocation. Like you can't just pay both of them big money and have them not cross over anyway. Long story short, we can move on to the offense. So I'll go here on the offensive side first. He is incredibly efficient. I looked at his profile. I'm sure you did too in preparation for this. I pulled some numbers. He finished in the top 10 of the league, qualified players, again, of the league in true shooting, effective field goal percentage, and 2-point percentage. So basically, he wasn't taking the most difficult shots in the world. We'll acknowledge that. Clint's up there too in a lot of these categories, as much as Hawks fans don't like when Clint tries to finish. But he is super efficient. I mean, I think in the second half of the season, post All-Star breaks, was, I guess, the last third, he had like a 72% true shooting. Like he finishes everything around the rim. He's a good free throw shooter at this point, take a step forward there. And we even saw the jump shot just a little bit. Quinn was encouraging him a little bit. So I want to start there. Like, what do you make of that progression? Because he's always going to have some challenges with his size, but the touch is not a concern at all. And they've been trying to push him a little bit when it comes to maybe a little bit more floaters. He shot, I think, 13 mid-rangers this year. Like he was taking some more shots outside of 12 feet. And I don't know if that's going to be a main feature moving forward, but they've always believed that he can shoot it at some point, and we're kind of seeing a little bit more of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different places you can start with him offensively from a conversation standpoint, which is great, right? But for me, it does really kind of start with the touch, right? The touch is already elite. Right? Incredible. And that opens up so much. He doesn't, it helps, especially since that he's not the biggest guy. Sometimes he has to go to the floater because he can't get past a really big defender that's there or what have you. That opens up so much, right? And then if you think about, they haven't done with him in the past, so we've talked about it, here and there. If you want to get him into the short roll, right, to help, Trey or DeJounte, whoever's running a pick and roll in the middle of the floor, a center who doesn't have the threat of the floater can be defended completely differently than a guy who has the floater plus the ability to dribble and pass, right? Which he has both of those things positionally, right? He can dribble it, he can pass it. And so that creates so much more strain on the opposing defense when the ball, let's say Trey is blitzed, the ball goes to Onyeka, say a step, above the free throw line. He's reading the floor. Where's my defender coming from? Where's the second defender coming from? Where's someone rotating from? I can create my own shot. I can put it on the floor, get closer to the rim, and attack a smaller defender. I can read the floor and make the right pass. That is like so much more than you can ever expect from like John Collins, for example, right? Yeah. I think Jalen has some of that. But to have it at the 5 is just a different thing, right? We saw in the series, where Golden State kept wanting to kind of take advantage of Anthony Davis kind of staying low and draw him out, right? And Looney wasn't able to really kind of force anything there, right? And Draymond, I mean, really no one kind of respects the shot, creation at all. I mean, you're at least going to pick your poison and be like, hey, Draymond, go put up shots. We got stuff running around out here, right? But it's the ability to kind of catch the ball, turn, do any of those three things well above average, and use that elite touch if it's going to end up being driving at the rim. There just aren't very many guys that can do that, right? We've watched Bam in postseasons struggle kind of creating his own shot, even though the Miami offense is to a degree built around that, at least until Jimmy got here, right? It was even higher in the kind of pecking order in their offensive choices there. And I would say right now, Onyeka has a lot more touch than Bam has, right? And then the jump shots coming, I think, did he make two or three threes in the regular season?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, he was 4 for 13. It looks like.
Okay,
yeah, four.
That's close. Yeah, and then he had that. Then he had that top of the key three in the Boston series.
Yep.
Took it with just complete confidence. And so for me, it's like I think that's coming along too. Now the question I have is, how much do you want to buy into him? How much do you want him to prioritize being able to hit that shot? Because he can, in my mind right now, he can put so much more stress on the defense attacking, like with the dribble and with the floater and all that sort of stuff. And so I just think in my mind, like Hawks fans want to get like kind of like, oh, well, I want to see him take 100 threes next year. It's like, be careful kind of what you're designing there, right? Because to an extent, sometimes when you're trying to create a second, third, fourth dimension for players through a development path, you start to erode areas where their primary value comes from and their strongest areas of play. And so to me, it kind of depends upon if he's playing with someone like, oh, if Quinn's like, we're going to have John dive more in the pick and roll to give John more opportunities like that. So we're going to put Onyeka in the corner and let him, stretch space the floor in that sense. Fantastic, right? But in my mind, it's like I don't want to see Onyeka start set shots from 13 feet like 4 times a game, or whatever, right? I want to see him continue to attack, stress the defense, and force them to react to you because I trust him to read the floor, read the play, make the right decision at a level that no one else at the 4 and 5, maybe Jalen's coming along there too, right? But that on a team that's built around Trey, that is so incredibly valuable to have. And in my mind, when I think about, okay, I'm in the war room trying to make a decision about, Clint, can we get it's the offensive pairing with Trey that is the number one reason I'm thinking of elevating Onyeka in terms of kind of what I'm building around there. Not so much the defense, even though I think he came along defensively as well. So it's the ball handling that we've only seen a little bit of. It's the shooting, which we just started to see. The passing, I think we've seen a decent amount of that. To have all of those dimensions at 22 years old, a guy who hasn't really been a starter, it's so uncommon.
Yeah, no, he checks so many boxes, and this is the first year that I think his chemistry with Trey improved. It's not what it has been with Clint. That's one of the things that's been overlooked, I think, by some people is that Trey loves Clint, and it's very obvious as to why that is. Clint has so many reps in the pick and roll going back to Houston, and he's a great screener, all those things. Onyeka's gotten better there, but you're right, 100%. Like the fact that his processing speed, in addition to his finishing, his touch, and also he's a good offensive rebounder. He's a very good offensive rebounder. He's not Clint, but that's like he's not very far off, honestly. Like the numbers are, I think he was in the top 15 or so of the league this year in offensive rebound rate. That's an area where his activity level could really help him. You don't have to be huge physically to be a great offensive rebounder, which I think he has already shown. So, like the fact that he does all those things, the passing, the potential playmaking, and doesn't take too much off the table because, it's one of those things where I'm guilty of this too. You can fall in love with the fact that maybe he'll be able to shoot. And I've always thought he'll be able to. The Hawks do too. We've seen that. Like Quinn drew up a few plays for him. It became sort of a big talking point. But I totally agree with what you said. I don't think his primary or even a main part of his value is ever going to be that. I think that it would help if he could take 100 threes eventually in his career and shoot 35%. Sure, that's a valuable thing you can do. Or you could be a more, maybe more dynamic 15-foot jump shooter than needing all the time in the world like he needs right now to take that set shot that you mentioned. But like that isn't going to be what breaks him out. I don't think. Maybe if he becomes just this otherworldly shooter that we're not seeing, but I think that's not likely to happen. So even with the touch he has, him attacking, him shooting floaters, him finishing at the rim is going to be much more effective, especially when you throw in his passing, like you said. So yeah, I think in the past they've been better actually offensively, as much as this sounds funny for people that don't like Clint's offense, with Trey and Clint than they had been with Trey and Onyeka. But it's not because of anything other than the pick and roll chemistry there and the offensive rebounding and the way that Clint and Trey had this great partnership. Onyeka does offer a lot more offensively. That's not breaking ground to say that. The only area really where Clint is more proven is on the glass and maybe as like a lob finisher. And Also, Clint's probably taking a half step back in that area. He's not the same explosive athlete that he used to be. Onyeka has so much more to offer. I think everybody knows that, but he really does so many different things that can help them that it's hard not to be excited about that, especially as he makes just, incremental gains. Like, for instance, I wrote some stuff down here. His turnover rate has gone down every year in the league. That's a natural thing for a young guy, but he's not a high turnover player. His usage rate is still pretty low, but it's ticking up every year. His rebound rate is ticking up every year. Like, he's not blowing anybody away with anything other than the efficiency when it comes to the numbers, but the fact that he's making the right decisions and he puts, I think you said it before, puts pressure on the defense. You can't overstate how important that is with Trey or without. Like, the fact that he can do all those things. And yeah, I don't know if he's going to get to the part where they're playing through him. That's been a popular idea. Like, can't they play through Okongwu? Maybe they can in 2 years. I don't know, but you don't have to be able to do that. There's a middle ground there where you could just be a short role playmaker and do some more stuff. They don't have to run their offense through him like some teams do. But the Bam comparisons are always out there. I hate comparisons for the most part, but he is a similar as probably I get. That's one of those comparisons where I don't hate it as much as I hate most comparisons. You know what I mean? Because if you're picking a guy in the league that's a current player, he's the guy you would probably pick for Okongwu as far as potential skill set and size and all those things. But not even marrying yourself to that. Just kind of let Onyeka be what he does. But the fact that he does, again, rebound, finish, process, and maybe a little bit of shooting, maybe gets to the line more. Kind of similar as Jalen, maybe just go back to your point before, being more intentional almost at attacking and getting to the line, because he makes the free throws too.
Yeah. I mean, kind of going back, Clint as a screener, we talked a lot about that. Clint is as nuanced, right?
He's so good.
And little things like if Trey doesn't have his angle, Clint will be like, toss me the ball and I'll pitch it back to you and we'll flip it, right?
Yep.
And and Onyeka is shown some of that, but Clint has a PhD in that, right? It's just crazy how good that is. On top of that, Clint can do any kind of screen you want and almost never gets called for a foul. We talked about earlier, the rebounding fouls.
I almost said it earlier when you said it, because he has so many fouls and moving screens and weird things like that. Yeah.
Right. So there's improvement needed there. And for me, it's if you want to get Trey as much help as possible on offense, it's Clint, right? If you want to have as much to work with as you can when Trey has to get the ball up, it's someone that's skilled like Onyeka is, right? So there's some contrasting there. When it comes to the shooting, when I think about what the value of his shooting could be, is this. Let's imagine he's playing at the 5 and JC's at the 4. The other team has a 4 and a 5, and you're we'd really like to put the guy defending John into the screen, into the pick and roll. Yeah. Well, if Onyeka can shoot from the corner, right, you can say, we're going to attack John's defender in the pick and roll, and we have the capacity to do that because we trust Onyeka to knock down the corner 3 and be respected. Or if he's playing with Jalen, and you're we want to put Jalen in the short roll and make him the decision maker because his defender is the guy that is more vulnerable. You can put him in the court, right? So it's those more situational and kind of scheme and structure-based kind of setups that really call on his development as a shooter to kind of really have a natural place and a productive and constructive place in the offense. Not so much we're going to get you 153s this year. Right. We're going to kind of create them sort of that being kind of a high level goal. That to me, that doesn't make any sense. But to create the versatility to go 1-4, 1-5, 2-4, 2-5 pick and roll, choose the defender. If Onyeka can spot up in the corner, if Onyeka can kind of help with that, that opens up so much more flexibility and optionality around how you attack, right? Which to me kind of gives a lot back to Trey to work with in a scenario where, for example, Clint's not on the team, right? And that's huge. And so that's where the shooting has a place for me. And that's where the shooting has value and there's worth investing in that, is to open up those options to attack the other team's more vulnerable defenders.
Yeah, it opens some doors. It's not going to ever, again, be a primary thing, but and again, I want to stress this one more time. Glenn and I both really value Clint, but it is limiting because Clint obviously just cannot do anything else on offense. He's either going to be in the pick and roll or he's going to be in the dunker spot, and that's it. He can't space. No one's ever going to guard him out there, and that does limit you. It doesn't mean that the Hawks have had great offense with Clint. It's not, they've been able to be good with Clint on the floor still in offense. But it does kind of put you in more narrow boxes. And I think with Quinn, especially now in place, as a guy probably has more weapon, maybe angles to attack, we'll say, than the previous regime probably did. I think Quinn's going to be a little bit more innovative in some ways, having that club in your bag of a center who doesn't have to be in every action or is not going to be coming up the works. And I've said it before, but if, for instance, I'll even frame this negatively on purpose. Let's say they find that they can't trade John because no one wants John. I'm not saying that's going to happen. Let's say that happens. It's a lot easier to bring back John and rebuild John's value if Onyeka is next to him versus Clint on offense. Absolutely. Now, Clint and John has been their foolproof plan to play better defense in the last 2 years, basically 3 years even. But on offense, that's a big reason why John's value has dropped, because he's playing with Clint and he just can't do anything except for space the floor because Clint's always there. Anyway, we've done this whole thing before, but because you brought up at the very beginning of the conversation, I do think that John is not the guy they have to have next to Onyeka, but I do believe that would work. We haven't seen a ton of it, but I think that would be an option if they were to go that route. And even again, if you just frame it as like they can't trade John, quote unquote, because they just can't get off his contract, which by the way, I don't believe, but maybe it's the case. There's an avenue there that's like defensible. It kind of just, it does make sense because I firmly believe they could trade Clint in 5 minutes. They could trade Clint right now. It'd be very easy to do. They may not get a king's ransom back for him, but there are 10 teams in the league that would improve drastically with Clint at center. That's not even debatable to me. So, and by the way, they're not going to trade barring a star trade. I'll just say this out loud. Barring maybe like a weird Jaylen Brown thing, they're not trading Onyeka. I think that it's going to be trade Clint or not something else. But just because I feel like we should at least say that out loud. I guess there are, in theory, 2 ways to change the center room. I can't see them trading Onyeka unless it's for a star. I would be shocked. So
yeah, agreed. It's just so interesting to think about the ways it could go. And like I said before, I think if you're building around Onyeka, you keep JC unless you can find another guy who can do the things that JC does, which is not impossible, right?
And it's also hard. I mean, I said it before too, but it's really, really hard. People, I'm sure, hate when I say this. It's really hard to trade both of your starting front court guys in the same summer.
Yep.
Doesn't mean they can't do it, but it's challenging. And those guys, it probably has to be 2 transactions because I doubt that a team's going to trade for John and Clint at the same time. So like, just practically speaking, it's not going to be, it's not easy to trade these 2 guys on $20+ million million a year deals in the same summer. They could do it, but anyway.
But I mean, it's interesting because again, on defense, we know what Clint can do. And Onyeka's emerging on that end with all the versatility and the athleticism and the lateral stuff. On offense, it's funny. Clint helps Trey when the ball's in Trey's hands more than Onyeka. Onyeka has a lot more to offer when the ball is forced out of Trey's hands. It's that's sort of a thing, one thing, two kind of scenario, right? Or on defense, it's like, okay, you're just doing different stuff scheme wise. And that's really the thing. And then if Onyeka can become that guy who can shoot from the corner, you can start mixing and matching your pick and roll attacks, as well. So, Onyeka opens up to a lot more options where I think you have a bit of a more rigid template you're working with Clint.
Agreed.
Although there's still a ton of value that comes from that template.
I think we've done a good job of giving all the caveats. I'm sure people that listen to this podcast are still going to yell at us for whatever we said about both guys, but we will do a whole podcast on Clint as well at some point, and I'm sure we'll repeat some of this, but it is it's worth just pointing out the nuances. And look, it's never antagonistic. It's just that these guys play the same position and they're different, and it's a decision they have to make at some point. So that's why we're going so far into that. But yeah, as far as like bringing it all full circle, Onyeka does a lot of things well. He's still 22 years old. Like I'm looking forward to having him be in a bigger role and showing what he can do, because I think he can be a game-changing center. I don't think he's going to be an all-NBA player probably, just because the odds of that are never in anyone's favor for the most part. But I think he can be a high-end, top 10 starting center in the league if things go well. And that's a heck of a player. And I look forward to seeing if that can happen. And if it happens, how soon it might happen and all that fun stuff. But we covered a lot here. Feel free to add anything else that you want to, Glenn. And if not, we will get out of here.
I think you put a great bow on it right there.
Professional segues and things. Glenn, thank you for doing this on a Memorial Day, giving me some time in the middle of a move on a holiday, and you are the greatest in the business for doing that. But where can people find your work normally?
Yeah, so ATL 29 podcast. I think Kevin and I will record that timing wise, probably before this drops, right?
There you go.
But as we work through the finals, Kevin and I'll, probably do an episode every 5 days or something like that, sharing our opinions there. And then we're probably just days away from starting some conversations around the draft as well.
It's time.
I know you're ramping up too, and even the stuff you've already put out there. Really enjoyed the great stuff coming out here. I dabble compared to the guys you bring on, the people you bring on here, right? Stuff like that. So it's great. But I try to build a perspective around who I think the Hawks should draft at like 15, right? More so than, and I do typically put a top 40 out, but or so. But I'm really more focused around kind of what the Hawks could do at their spot and things like that. So yeah, find me there. I still support, and active with the guys at Peace Hoops and all that sort of stuff. And then on Twitter, if you're not following me at Willis_Glen, always enjoy conversation over there.
Check out Glen's work. He is amazing at breaking things down, and I'm sure the draft coverage will be entirely fantastic from you and very below average from Kevin. Hi, Kevin. I'm kidding. I'm kidding in a lot of ways, folks. Don't worry. Kevin and I are still friends. But as for everybody else listening to the podcast, please subscribe to the show. We've been doing this player capsule series. This is, I think, the 5th or 6th player we've done. We have more to come because Glen is gracious enough to give you all the time. So subscribe to this show, follow Glen's work, and we'll see you all next time.